Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I woke up because my phone buzzed on the nightstand, the vibration shaking the wood enough to jolt me out of a foggy sleep. The screen lit up bright white in the dark, glowing against the ceiling and walls in a way that felt harsher than usual. It was an Amber Alert. I didn't even read the text at first because my eyes were still adjusting, and it was the shape of the light, not the message, that made me notice something was wrong. My bedroom door wasn't closed. It stood open by a few inches, just wide enough to show the darker rectangle of the hallway beyond. I always shut the door before bed. It's a habit drilled into me since childhood. Something about liking the feeling of being sealed in for the night after long shifts at the hospital. I never leave it cracked, not even by accident. I stayed still for a moment, lying halfway on my side, my breath caught in my throat. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator somewhere deeper in the place. I tried to tell myself I must have been too tired when I got home. I had worked a late shift in Uptown, finished charting after midnight, and drove home in a haze. Maybe I hadn't paid attention when getting into bed. Maybe I left it open without realizing. Then I heard the footsteps. They were faint but undeniable, slow. Not the random settling of the old hardwood floors, but the uneven, weighted shift of someone transferring their balance from one foot to the other. They came from the end of the hallway, near the living room, the exact direction I had walked in from a few hours earlier. The sound stopped, then resumed, then stopped again, as if whoever it was kept pausing to listen. Each creak made the hair on my arms rise. Someone was inside my apartment. Not outside. Not on the stairs. Inside. My heart started pounding so violently it felt like it might shake the bed. I listened harder, barely breathing. The footsteps grew closer, one slow shift at a time, muffled slightly by the area rug but still audible on the exposed floor near my bedroom. It was the kind of movement someone makes when they don't want to be heard, when they're testing how quiet they can be. The kind that has intention behind it. I slid my hand off the bed until my fingers found the metal desk lamp on the nightstand. It was small, maybe 2 pounds at most, but it was the only thing within reach that felt like it could do any damage if I had to swing it. I wrapped my fingers around the base while keeping my eyes locked on the narrow opening of the door. The steps stopped again, and then came a different sound, breathing. Slow, heavy, controlled, not quite a pant but deeper than a normal inhale. It was right outside my room. I could sense the closeness, like someone was inches from the threshold, leaning in just enough to listen for any movement from me. I felt an instinctive push of adrenaline that made my hands shake around the lamp. Staying still didn't feel like an option anymore. Waiting felt like giving the person the upper hand. Every part of me buzzed with that fight or flight tension that overrides all calm thinking. I couldn't see his face, couldn't even see a full silhouette, but I knew someone was out there, and if I didn't move first, I didn't know what he planned to do next. I pushed myself off the mattress and charged through the doorway with the lamp gripped tight. The movement felt clumsy because of how tense I was, but it was fast enough. The hallway was darker than my room, except for the faint yellow glow from the oven light in the kitchen spilling out just enough to outline shapes. I didn't see the man's features, only the tall black outline of a body turning sharply, startled by my sudden movement. He ran immediately, his footsteps now loud and fast, sprinting toward the living room. For a brief second, I thought he would corner himself near the balcony, that I might be able to trap him, or at least break his momentum. But he didn't hesitate at all. He ran full speed to the sliding door, shoved it aside, and vaulted over the railing without stopping. My apartment is on the second floor. The The sound of his landing was a heavy thud followed by branches snapping from the shrubs below. A moment later I heard fast, uneven steps hitting the ground in the alley behind my building, one of them dragging just enough to make it obvious he was injured. Then everything quieted again, leaving only my own shaking breath echoing in the hallway. I didn't go outside to check. I shut the balcony door, locked it, locked the front door, locked every window, and then sat on the edge of the couch for several minutes, trying to steady my breathing. My hands were trembling badly, and it took longer than it should have to get my thoughts in order. Eventually, I called the police. The officer who showed up took notes, asked me to walk through what happened, checked the locks, and made a report. He mentioned someone in the neighborhood had been breaking in through unlocked doors recently, slipping inside when people weren't paying attention. He described a man who generally matched the person I saw. Hearing that didn't make me feel better. If anything, it made the whole thing worse, because it confirmed this wasn't some one-off freak moment. Someone had been doing this on purpose, targeting homes that seemed vulnerable. I didn't tell the officer everything. I didn't tell him the part that made my stomach twist, in a way the break in itself didn't. I didn't mention how long the guy had been inside. I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud until I knew exactly what the footage showed. After the officer left, I stayed awake until the sun came up because I was too afraid to close my eyes again. I kept replaying the shape of the man in the hallway, the sound of his slow steps, the breathing right outside the door. It felt surreal and real at the same time, like my brain couldn't decide which way to process it. Eventually, when the daylight filled the apartment enough that the shadows didn't look threatening anymore, I pulled up the door camera footage on my phone. My front door has a small battery-powered camera mounted on the inside frame, angled to capture the entrance and part of the hallway. I'd installed it months earlier because I had a package go missing and wanted something I could check quickly if anything felt off. Most nights it recorded nothing but me coming and going, the occasional shift of light from a passing car, or a neighbor's footsteps from the hallway outside the apartment. The first thing I checked was the time. He entered at 20:17 a.m. That detail hit me immediately because I hadn't gone to sleep until a little after 1:45. He must have slipped in not long after the lights went out. I tapped on the screen, dragging the timeline forward in small increments. The camera captured him walking in quietly, not bothering to close the door all the way behind him. He stood still for a long moment after stepping inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. Then he moved slowly toward the hallway leading to my bedroom, not going in, just walking up to the threshold before turning around and disappearing back toward the living room. 10 minutes later, he returned. He stood the same way, still and patient, watching the half-open door into my room. After another pause, he walked away again. The footage showed him doing this over and over. Every 10 to 15 minutes he came back. Sometimes he stood there for nearly a full minute. Sometimes he leaned a bit closer, though the camera didn't catch his face. He only ever lifted his head enough that the top of his hair and the outline of his shoulders showed. The way he held himself made my skin crawl. He moved like someone studying something, like someone examining a sleeping person from just outside the room. With each return he stayed longer. The last time, just minutes before my phone buzzed with the Amber Alert, he stood at the door motionless for so long that I had to fast forward just to confirm. He eventually stepped back. He wasn't searching the apartment for valuables or rifling through drawers. He wasn't opening cabinets or checking closets. He never went near the kitchen. He didn't touch anything at all. He only watched me sleep. When the buzzing from my phone lit up the room, that was when he froze and backed away, startled by the sudden glow. The next second he turned and ran. The same moment I grabbed the lamp and rushed out. Seeing it laid out in front of me made the whole thing heavier. and sharper than it had felt in the moment. I had been asleep while a stranger stood in my hallway over and over, just a few feet from my bed. Each time he returned, he got a little closer, a little bolder, as if he were waiting for something. I tried to imagine what could have happened. If the alert hadn't gone off, if I'd slept through the night without moving, if he had decided to step inside, instead of just watching from the hall. The thought left a cold feeling in my chest that didn't go away even when the sun was high outside. In the days that followed, I changed every lock in the apartment. I bought new cameras, stronger ones, with better angles. I added a security bar to the sliding balcony door and a second deadbolt to the front one. I didn't sleep properly for a long time, because every small noise sounded like footsteps. Every shift in the shadows looked like someone standing there again. But the one thing I couldn't change was the fact that he had been inside while I was unconscious, walking around freely without waking me. He had over an hour alone in my home. The police never called back with updates. I checked local news sites for days, hoping to see something about an arrest, hoping someone else had reported the same man and caught a clearer look at him. Nothing came up. Maybe he moved on to another neighborhood. Maybe he's still out there trying doors, waiting for one to be forgotten unlocked again. I don't leave mine unlocked anymore, not even for a moment. I check them 3 times before bed, sometimes 4, and even then, when the lights go out, I still feel the lingering presence of that dark outline in the hallway, the quiet breathing just inches beyond the door, and the knowledge that I didn't wake up until he wanted to leave. I moved into the house in Flagstaff because it felt quiet in a way that suited me. A single-story place on a street lined with ponderosa pines, the kind of neighborhood where the air always smells faintly of sap and the nights fall hard and dark. The interior was simple, older but kept in decent shape, with a narrow hallway that ran between the bedrooms and the living room. In the center of that hallway was a square panel in the floor, held shut by 2 old metal latches. The previous owner told me it led to a crawlspace used mostly for plumbing access, nothing worth worrying about. I never had any reason to open it. For 4 years, it was just part of the floor. Another detail I stopped noticing. Most nights I followed the same routine. I finished work, made something easy for dinner, and let the hours slip by in front of the television. That night felt no different. Cold outside, warm inside, a soft hum from the heater vent near the wall. I remember sitting on the couch with a blanket over my legs, watching a show I'd already seen once, letting the repetitive noise of it keep the house from feeling too quiet. It was around the time the pine trees outside start creaking in the wind, a familiar sound that usually blends into the background. I only noticed the first noise because it didn't match anything I knew. It had a sudden, small, sharp quality, something like wood dragging against wood. It came from somewhere near the hallway. I paused the show, waiting for it again, but the house settled back into its usual stillness. No wind howling, no traffic, just the faint hum from the heater. I decided it might have been the vent expanding with the heat. Old houses do that, and mine was no exception. I shrugged it off and unpaused the show. Later, when the digital clock on the cable box showed 11 to 26, the sound came again, but this time it didn't feel subtle. It had a dragging pull to it, heavier, as if someone was pushing something across a surface right underneath the floorboards. It traveled from the far end of the hall toward the middle, slow and unmistakable, the kind of sound that makes your body stiffen before you even understand why. I muted the TV without thinking. The air in the living room suddenly felt hollow. I stood up, legs tense, and grabbed the flashlight I kept in a drawer near the kitchen. Its weight felt cold in my hand. When I stepped into the hallway, everything seemed tighter. The shadows felt more defined, the edges of the walls sharper than usual. I followed the beam of the flashlight across the floor until it reached the crawlspace panel. It wasn't sitting flat. One corner was raised, just barely, maybe the width of a fingertip. It was enough to show a thin black line where I had never seen one. I crouched down slowly, the floor creaking under my weight, and angled the flashlight toward the crack. I expected to see dirt or insulation or nothing at all, just darkness. Instead, I saw a pale hand pushing upward. My mind froze long before my body reacted. The skin looked washed out and dirty, with raw red skin around the fingertips, as if they'd been scraping rough surfaces for too long. The fingers curled against the underside of the panel, pressing up with effort. I felt myself lean backward without meaning to, the movement clumsy, the flashlight shaking in my hand so violently the beam jittered across the floor. The panel lifted another inch. Something in me jolted awake, and I scrambled backward until my shoulder hit the hallway wall. My heartbeat felt loud enough to drown out everything else. I stood up too fast, nearly slipping, and ran to the kitchen. There were chairs by the table, just cheap wooden ones, but they were the only things close enough to feel useful. I dragged one into the hallway and slammed it down on top of the panel, shoving it over the raised corner. The legs clattered against the floor. It didn't feel like enough, so I grabbed a second chair and pressed it down too, leaning on it with all my weight. My arms shook from adrenaline. From beneath the floor, something hit the underside of the panel with enough force to rattle both chairs. The blow traveled through the wood into my legs. I held the chairs down harder, breathing so fast it didn't feel like I was getting any air at all. The next 11 or 12 minutes stretched out in a way that didn't feel real. I kept one knee braced on a chair, one hand gripping the second, afraid to ease up even an inch. At one point there was another thud, not as hard but still enough to shake the legs of the chairs. I didn't shout or call out or say anything at all. It was just me in the hallway, heart hammering, waiting for the sound of sirens I hoped were close. When the police finally arrived, the lights from their vehicles flashed across the windows, filling the living room with quick bursts of red and blue. I stepped back as they made their way inside and moved toward the hallway. I remember the way their boots sounded on the wood floor, steady and controlled. They had their equipment ready, flashlights pointed at the panel. I stood behind them, out of the way, feeling strangely detached, as if I were watching everything from a distance. They removed the chairs carefully and unlatched the panel. For a moment the opening looked like nothing but a square of darkness cut into the floor. Then their lights swept through the space, revealing the low crawl space I'd never seen before. Dust drifted in the beams. A man was lying down there on his side, as if he had curled himself into a corner to stay hidden. His clothes were filthy, covered in dust and gray insulation fibers that clung to every surface. His hair was matted, his face thin. Beside him was a backpack partially unzipped, with what looked like granola bar wrappers and a folded jacket spilling out. A small battery lantern cast a weak, uneven glow around him, illuminating the cramped area where he had apparently been living. He didn't resist. He didn't speak either. He just blinked up at the sudden light before the officers pulled him out. I stood there in the hallway, staring at the empty crawl space and trying to grasp the idea that someone had been beneath my home, listening to everything I did, waiting for moments when the house felt still. Later, when the officers were outside with him, one of them explained that people sometimes slip into crawl spaces or basements when they need shelter, especially near wooded areas where houses sit a bit apart. He mentioned that the timing of the noises made sense, that I probably startled the man when I paused the TV, since the sudden silence could have made him freeze or try to move. He said it quietly, not as a warning but as a simple fact. I walked the house after they left, checking every door and window, even though they were already locked. The hallway looked normal again, but the panel seemed different now, as though the line where it met the floor held a memory of what had happened. I kept seeing that pale hand pushing up, the raw fingertips scraping at the wood. That night I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the bedroom. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, the heater humming the way it always did, the familiar smell of pine drifting from outside. The house looked exactly the same, but it no longer felt sealed off from the world. There was a sense that the space under the floor wasn't just an empty void meant for pipes and wiring. It had held a person, day after day, quietly listening, quietly existing just beneath my feet. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed a bag and left for a hotel on the other side of town. When I stepped out the door, the air was cold and thin, the sky pale with early light. I locked the door behind me, but it felt symbolic more than protective. The house had already been open in a way I hadn't understood. Eventually, I arranged for a contractor to seal the crawlspace completely, not just with a simple panel but with reinforced boards and new hardware that couldn't be pried up from below. Still, even with the repair, I found myself unable to settle back into the routines I once had. Every creak made me pause. Every shift in the house's old bones felt like a warning. I still live there, but the hallway never feels ordinary anymore. When I walk across it, I can't help thinking about the space beneath me, the cramped dark where someone hid without a sound. The house didn't change shape, but my sense of it did. It isn't just a place where I sleep or eat or watch TV. It's a structure with layers I never paid attention to. And for a while, one of those layers held a stranger who listened to my footsteps every night, waiting for the moments when the noise above him paused just long enough for him to move. I had gotten used to waking up in the middle of the night by then, or at least I thought I had. Our daughter was 6 months old, and her feedings were scattered through the dark hours in a way that made time feel strange. Some nights I drifted through them half asleep, barely aware of the world outside the small pool of light from the nightstand lamp. Other nights I lay awake long after she settled, listening for small sounds in the house, unsure if I was being paranoid or simply worn down by the new rhythm of parenthood. That night felt normal at first. I remembered lying on my side, facing the edge of the mattress, waiting for sleep to return after her last feeding. The house was quiet in that heavy way it gets around 2 in the morning, when even the heaters and pipes seem reluctant to make noise. I could feel the faint warmth of my husband's body beside me, steady and unmoving, and I was grateful for the silent moment. At 2:03 in the morning, the baby monitor pinged. It was a short electronic sound, gentle enough not to jolt me but firm enough to pull me all the way out of drowsiness. I reached for the monitor screen with the same automatic pull I always felt when it lit up, a mix of worry and habit. I expected to see her rolling or kicking her legs, or maybe the cat brushing past the crib like she sometimes did. What I saw instead was a shape, a human shape, a figure leaning over the crib, partly shadowed by the angle of the camera. My mind reached for the simplest explanation, and for a split second I thought it was my husband. But when I reached back and felt his shoulder under the blanket, still warm and relaxed with sleep, something inside me went cold. I eased my hand across his arm to make sure he was really there. He stirred slightly, shifting but not rising, and I knew then he hadn't gotten up. I stayed frozen and just stared at the glowing screen. The man on the monitor wasn't moving. His posture was bent slightly forward, head lowered toward the crib like he was studying something inside it, or listening. Everything around me tightened at once. My chest, my back, even my fingers curled against the plastic frame of the monitor. I couldn't take my eyes off the shadowed outline. The low light mode flattened his features into darkness so I couldn't see his face, but the shape of his shoulders and the angle of his arms were too defined to be mistaken. It wasn't an illusion or a glitch. Someone was inside the nursery. My husband woke fully when he realized the room's silence wasn't normal. The instant he saw the monitor, his whole body went rigid, and there was a split second where neither of us breathed. Then both of us moved at once, the kind of movement that comes from instinct rather than thought. We pushed off the bed and crossed the room, barely aware of the floor under our feet. All I could picture was our daughter lying there not knowing anything was wrong, and some stranger standing over her with no expression, no movement, nothing that belonged in that room. The hallway felt colder than usual when we stepped into it. The house was always a little drafty, but this was a different kind of cold, the kind that sits on the back of your neck. As we climbed the stairs, I tried to listen for footsteps or shifting weight, anything that would tell us the man was still in the room. The only sound was the faint crying starting through the baby monitor, a thin wail that rose and fell as we got closer. When we reached the landing, the nursery door was cracked open, just wide enough to show a sliver of the dim nightlight glow inside. We had always kept it closed, always. Seeing it open like that made the entire floor feel unfamiliar. Our daughter cried louder when we stepped inside. She was lying in the crib, face red and squinted, kicking both legs. But the room was empty. The corner where the man had been standing on the monitor was vacant, just a small stack of toys and the dresser in its usual place. Nothing disturbed, nothing knocked over. At first glance it looked exactly like any other night. Then I saw the window. It was open just slightly, the bottom raised enough to let in a narrow line of cold air. The night outside was dark and still, the porch light faintly illuminating the yard below. The screen hung crooked against the frame, cut along one edge. It looked like someone had sliced through it in a single motion. My husband moved around the room quickly, searching the closet, behind the door, under the crib, anywhere a person could hide. There was nothing, only the sharp chill of the open window and the faint smell of the outside air drifting into the space where we kept our daughter warm and safe. The police arrived much later, after we made the call with shaking hands. They walked through the house with flashlights, checking every room and every possible entry point. Downstairs they found the back door closed but unlocked. We never left it unlocked. When they went outside to the lawn beneath the nursery, they found footprints pressed into the soft dirt near the wall. The shape of them looked messy and uneven, like the person had climbed up or down in a hurry. There were smeared handprints on the siding, faint but visible enough to show the shape of fingers dragging downward. Seeing those prints made my stomach twist. It was one thing to know someone had been there, another to see the physical marks left behind. The footage on the monitor was the part that stayed with me the longest. The officer suggested we check the SD card to see if anything recorded before the motion alert. We didn't expect much, maybe a few seconds or minute at most. Instead, the card held nearly 2 hours of video. The man had entered the nursery long before we woke. The recording showed him standing in the far corner of the room, almost completely still, his outline blending with the shadows. Sometimes he shifted slightly, tilting his head as if looking at the crib from a distance. Other times he stood so still he almost seemed like part of the furniture. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the shape of it turned toward the crib. He stayed there as our daughter slept, as the night passed quietly through the house, watching her without any sound or movement. Near the end of the footage he suddenly straightened, took a slow step toward the crib, then another until he was leaning over it just like the image we saw on the monitor. He stayed like that for a long stretch of seconds, his hands at his sides, his head lowered. Then he stepped back, moved toward the window, and slipped out of sight as the screen went dark. After the police left, the house felt different. The nursery that once held soft light and the smell of baby lotion now felt too exposed, as if the walls were thinner. The night outside the window didn't feel like a quiet backdrop anymore. It felt like something watching back. We replaced the window screen, added locks, installed cameras, changed the door codes, and replaced the back door entirely. For a while we even slept in shifts, one of us staying awake in the hallway outside the nursery. The officers told us the intruder probably picked our home at random, that these kinds of things happened rarely and usually didn't repeat. They said we had been lucky, that he left without taking anything or harming anyone. But luck didn't feel like the right word when I thought about the 2 silent hours he spent standing in that room. There was nothing lucky about watching that footage and realizing how close he had been while we slept just below the stairs. In time, life steadied again. Our daughter grew older, and the memory of that night softened at the edges, though it never faded entirely. I still think about the footage sometimes, especially when I walk past the nursery door late at night. I picture the unmoving figure in the corner, the slow tilt of his head, the moment he leaned over the crib. What stays with me most is the fact that we only woke because the monitor pinged at 2003. If it hadn't, we might never have known he was there at all. I always relied on the alerts from the security system more than anything else I owned. Living alone had made routines that most people would call paranoid feel normal to me. I checked the locks twice every night. I kept the breaker switch for the emergency lights within arm's reach of the couch. I left certain lamps unplugged so the house would go fully dark with one motion. Every choice was a layer of control, a way to balance the uneasiness that came from being the only person responsible for my own safety in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. On that night, I had been sitting on the couch with the television sound low. The glow of the screen washed over the living room in soft blue pulses. A cold cup of tea sat untouched on the coffee table. The house felt still in the way it usually did at the end of the day. I had left the blinds half open, and the street light outside sent a faint orange bar of light across the floor. It was peaceful in the small, predictable way I'd trained myself to appreciate. At 9:54 p.m., my phone vibrated on the cushion beside me. The familiar chime of the security app blended briefly with the quiet hum of the refrigerator. When I glanced down, the text on the screen felt like a punch to the chest. Back door opened. I stayed completely still, almost as if not moving would somehow change the meaning of the words. I waited for a second alert showing the door closed again, or some explanation. Nothing followed. The silence pressed against me from all sides. I could feel my heartbeat pick up as if the room had suddenly become smaller. I sat facing the hallway, and the kitchen was around the corner to the right. From where I was, I couldn't see the back door or anything past that doorway. I listened, the way people do when they're suddenly aware of every break in the normal rhythm of a house. At first, I heard only the refrigerator cycling, the faint rustle of the heater vent, and the ticking clock over the dining table. Then, behind all of that, a soft shift in weight on wood. Not a creak. Something slower, like a dragging step on the kitchen floor. My fingers found the emergency light breaker by instinct. I flipped it off. The house dropped into darkness except for the thin orange glow from outside. The sudden lack of light made everything sharper. The temperature felt colder. My eyes adjusted just enough to see the hallway walls and the faint outline of the doorway into the kitchen. That was when a shape passed across the far wall. It was subtle and then unmistakable. A shoulder, a head, and then the long shadow of an arm moving with controlled slowness. The stranger was between the back door and the kitchen counter, moving with a steady confidence that made my stomach twist. This wasn't someone stumbling around in panic or rushing to grab something. It was deliberate, practiced movement. Someone who knew how to melt into silence. I didn't breathe. I waited for the shadow to move again. It didn't. Whoever it was had stopped. I forced myself off the couch with slow, measured steps. My legs felt weak, but I kept them steady. I moved toward the front entry, staying along the wall so the floorboards wouldn't shift. I didn't let myself think beyond the next few inches of movement. All I wanted was to get outside the house without drawing the stranger's attention. The moment I cracked open the front door, the cold air hit me, sharp and clean. I stepped out and eased the door shut behind me. My car was parked along the short driveway and I slipped inside, locking the doors immediately. Only then did I let myself breathe. My phone showed the same alert, nothing more. The house stood quiet behind me, looking as normal as it always had. I called 911 from the driver's seat, hands shaking more than I expected. The minutes before the police arrived stretched out in a way that made every passing headlight on the street feel like it belonged to the intruder leaving through another exit. When the police finally went inside, I stayed in the car, watching the flashlight sweep across the windows. They searched every room, every corner, every closet. No broken windows, no forced locks, nothing missing or moved. But when they walked the hallway with their lights, the beam paused on something that made my skin crawl even from outside. A trail of muddy footprints started just inside the back door. The prints were heavy, like the shoes had been wet and thick with dirt. They continued through the kitchen, then into the hallway, and ended halfway down it. The trail simply stopped in the middle of the floor, as if the person had lifted their feet off the ground and floated away. There were no prints leading anywhere else. Not toward the bedrooms. Not toward the living room. Not even back toward the door they must have come in from. The officers discussed the strange pattern in low tones while I stood by the open doorway. I kept looking from the prints to the kitchen table to the hallway, trying to imagine a person walking through my house, and then choosing to stop in that exact spot. It made no sense, but the unease it left behind stayed with me long after they finished the search. The official explanation was that the intruder must have slipped out before the officers arrived. That didn't line up with the alert timestamp or the missing exit prints, but I wanted to believe it. Anything was better than picturing someone still inside. They locked the back door again, reset the alarm panel, and told me to call if anything else happened. I changed the batteries in the door sensor and tested it twice before going to bed that night. I slept poorly, waking at every sound, convinced I could hear faint footsteps behind the walls. 2 nights passed. The house felt wrong in a way that I couldn't explain. I found myself checking corners before stepping into rooms, testing the alarm panel obsessively, and glancing toward the hallway at random moments. Living alone had always made me cautious, but this felt different, like being watched from somewhere just out of sight. On the second night after the break-in, I tried to unwind by reading in bed. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp. My phone lay beside me. When it vibrated, I didn't even need to look. I felt the change come over me before my eyes reached the screen. Biescado R open end, 9:04 p.m. The time was identical. The alert tone was identical. The feeling that spread through me was worse than the first time. It wasn't surprise anymore. It was a heavy certainty that something was repeating on purpose. I got out of bed and crossed the room, keeping my footsteps soft even though I knew I wouldn't go back down the hallway myself. I stepped outside just like before, phone in hand. I made the call faster this time, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. The same officers arrived, though their expressions shifted when they entered the house. I stayed outside again, watching from the driveway as they moved through with careful precision. After a few minutes, they came back out and said the alarm panel showed nothing, no open back door, no logged entry. Instead, the system displayed a manual override used from inside the house. Someone had typed the code into the panel. Someone who knew it well enough to shut off the alarms before leaving or hiding. The officers searched every inch of the house again. They checked under the bed, inside the attic crawl space, behind the water heater. They didn't find anything alive inside. But they found a detail I'd missed on the panel. The smudges on the buttons weren't mine. The light coating of dust around the edges had been disturbed in a pattern that matched wider fingertips, like someone had pressed each number firmly and without hesitation. I felt something settle in me then, not a sudden panic but a realization that someone had spent time in my house. Real time. Enough to walk through my hallway, stand long enough to track mud across the floor, learn the layout, and read the 4-digit code I entered every day without thinking. The muddy footprints were no longer the strangest part. The shadow in the kitchen was no longer the worst part. The idea that someone had stood behind me at some point, close enough to see the panel clearly, was what stayed with me. The officers recommended that I stay somewhere else for the night. I agreed without hesitation. Before leaving, I changed the code at the panel, watching the numbers blink as the system accepted the update. Then I unplugged the entire system, cutting off power to the sensors, and locked the house behind me. I didn't return for several days. When I finally did, I brought a contractor with me to inspect every inch of the place. He checked the crawl space, the attic, the ductwork, and the hollow gaps in the walls. Near the back door, behind the lower cabinets, he found a narrow space where insulation had been pushed aside. The area was small, barely enough room for a person to crouch. But the dust patterns showed it had been used recently. A hidden corner someone had slipped into when the police searched the first time. A place that explained why the footprints stopped, why no exit prints appeared, and how someone had waited inside long enough to watch me enter the security code. The contractor sealed the space, reinforced the door frame, and replaced the sensor entirely. I changed the alarm code again. I moved a dresser in front of my bedroom door. I stopped sitting with my back to the hallway. I never received another alert at 9:54 p.m., but I still check the panel every night. I still freeze at the sound of a creak in the kitchen. I still replay the memory of that shadow moving across the wall. Nothing was ever stolen, and no one was ever caught. But someone had been inside long enough to learn exactly how I lived, where I stood when I checked the locks, and how I entered the code. Someone had known the rhythm of my house better than I did. The thought that stays with me the most is not the open door or the muddy prints. It's that quiet moment in the dark when I watched the silhouette move, and it paused as if it knew I was there. The police looked for signs of forced entry, but the truth was more unsettling. The intruder had never needed to force their way in. They had already learned how to walk through my home like they belonged there. I always sleep with the curtains half closed, just enough for a sliver of the backyard to show through when the moon is out. My house sits slightly elevated on a small slope, so my bedroom window is about 10 feet above the ground. It gives a view of the patchy lawn, the worn fence, the apple tree that never grew right, and the narrow concrete path leading from the back door to the shed. Most nights it's quiet back there, just the faint hum of distant traffic or the rustle of leaves if the wind picks up. I've lived alone long enough to know every normal sound the place makes, every shift in temperature, every creak in the wooden frame when it settles. That familiarity used to help me sleep. At 4:12 a.m. I woke up because something felt wrong in the room. Not a sound at first, just a shift in the air around me, the kind that pulls you out of a deep sleep before you fully understand why. The light outside was that pale bluish, gray that happens before sunrise, dim but enough to see the outlines of furniture. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what had broken the quiet. Nothing seemed out of place. The heater wasn't running. The refrigerator downstairs had that steady hum it always had. The wind wasn't moving. My mind drifted toward the idea that maybe I just dreamed something and the leftover tension was hanging on. Then I heard it. A whisper from the other side of the glass. It was soft enough that if I had been even slightly more asleep, I might have convinced myself it was part of a dream. But I was awake, fully and sharply awake, listening to the sound of someone outside my window whispering my full name, almost dragging the syllables out, like stretching something until it thins. Adrian. My full name. Not the shortened version everyone uses. No one says it like that anymore. Not since years ago. Hearing it drift through the window in the quiet of the early morning felt wrong in a way that was hard to even process. My heartbeat changed immediately, thudding hard enough that I felt it in my throat. I didn't move at all. I kept my hands next to my sides under the blanket, as if staying motionless would somehow make the voice lose interest. My first instinct was denial. Someone outside must have been saying something else, and my brain twisted it into my name. Maybe it was just the wind catching on something, or an animal making a sound that my half-asleep mind tried to interpret. Anything felt more reasonable than someone standing 10 feet below my window whispering directly at me. Then it came again. A low, breathy sound stretched in a slow pull. Adrian. Not rushed. Not frantic. Calm. Too calm. The way someone might say a name when they're trying to draw a reaction. My skin tightened instantly, the kind of cold that starts at the surface before sinking deeper. That whisper had direction. It wasn't drifting randomly in the air. It was aimed upward, aimed at the window, aimed at me. I stayed completely still. I didn't shift the blanket. I didn't sit up. I didn't even look toward the window. I stared straight ahead, trying to stay quiet enough that the person outside wouldn't know I was awake. I tried to breathe through my nose as quietly as possible. Each breath felt too loud. Then came the tapping. Slow, rhythmic tapping on the glass itself. Not a frantic knocking, just 3 taps spaced evenly apart. A pause. Then 3 more. Tap, 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 like someone trying to coax a pet toward them, or trying to get a child's attention. Gentle but intentional. My body felt locked in place. The tapping continued in that calm pattern. The person outside wasn't in any hurry. They weren't trying to break the window or force their way in. They were just letting me know they were there. Waiting. Listening. I reached slowly toward my phone with only my fingertips moving under the blanket. I kept the screen dimmed out of habit, and I didn't raise it to look at it. I just held it flat against the mattress and typed the emergency number from muscle memory. I didn't say a word. I didn't dare. I just stayed there with the phone pressed against my ear, listening to the silence on the other end. The whispering outside stopped after a while. The tapping stopped too. The quiet after that was somehow worse, because I didn't know if the person had moved away or was still standing there, staring up at the window, waiting for some reaction. When the officers finally arrived, I heard the distant crunch of their boots on gravel before anyone knocked on my door. I let them in and followed them to the backyard. The air was damp, the grass wet from the night. The ground below my window showed clear impressions where someone had stood. A full set of footprints darkened by dew, facing upward, toes angled toward the glass. The officers followed the tracks to the fence, and when they lifted their flashlights, they found smudges higher up. Marks from someone using the fence slats to pull themselves over. There was nothing else. No sign of forced entry anywhere. No signs of someone lingering. Just the footprints and the trail over the wooden fence. The officers told me they'd patrol the area, said to call again if anything else happened. They were calm about it, The way people get calm when they deal with unsettling things often enough that they forget how alarming it is for someone who doesn't. Days went by. Then weeks. I tried to let myself believe it had been a one-time incident. Maybe some stranger cutting through yards. Maybe someone drunk. Maybe someone who mistook the house for another. Anything to push down the possibility that it had been deliberate. But the most difficult part wasn't the memory of the whisper. It was the way it had used my full name, said in a tone that suggested familiarity. Whether real or imagined, it lodged itself into my thoughts. It made me think back to people I had once known, people I wasn't in contact with anymore, people who had reasons to be angry, reasons to hold on to old grudges, reasons to seek me out. The more I tried to dismiss the idea, the more it settled in, making me replay every detail of the voice as I had heard it. Months passed without another incident. I stopped checking the window every night. I stopped keeping the phone in my hand while falling asleep. The house went back to feeling like mine. Then, on certain nights when the air is still and the backyard is especially quiet, I hear it again. Not every night. Not even often. Just enough to keep the memory alive. The faintest tapping on the glass. So light that if I weren't awake already I'd never hear it. Always spaced apart the same way. 3 taps. A pause, 3 more. When I look at the window, nothing is there. No face, no shadow, no movement in the yard. The grass looks undisturbed. The fence is still. The night seems normal, but the sound is always the same. Soft, measured, patient. Someone reminding me that they were here once. Someone letting me know they can come back whenever they want. I live alone in a small one-story house on a quiet street, the kind of place people drive past without noticing. The yard is uneven, the paint around the windows chipped, and the gutters always seem to catch leaves. It has a basement I barely use, mostly because I never needed the extra space. The basement always felt colder than the rest of the house, and the concrete floor had a faint dusty smell no matter how many times I cleaned it. I kept the door to it shut out of habit, and over time it just became part of the background, the way a refrigerator hum becomes something you stop hearing. That night, I was doing dishes like any other night. The kitchen light has a slight flicker at the edges, something the bulb does when it's about to go but never quite finishes the job. I remember the warm water running over my hands, the sound of plates knocking together, the window above the sink showing nothing but a reflection of the room behind me. The rest of the house was quiet. It was almost 10 and the neighborhood outside had already settled into that late calm. Even the stray dogs that sometimes barked near the alley were silent. I was rinsing a pan when I heard the basement door handle move behind me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful. It was a tiny metallic twitch, like someone trying the handle just enough to test it. For a second, I honestly thought I imagined it. Sometimes houses shift, wood expands, things settle. But this was different. It was unmistakably the sound of metal moving. I stopped what I was doing and turned around. The door sat flush in its frame at the end of the short hallway, the same dull off, white paint staring back. The handle had stopped. Nothing moved. No sound followed. I stood there with dripping hands, water running down my wrists, my breath starting to come faster even though I was trying to control it. I wiped my hands on the towel by the sink without taking my eyes off the door. I walked toward it slowly, each step heavy on the old laminate flooring. The closer I got, the more aware I became of how quiet the house truly was. My heartbeat felt louder than my footsteps. I pressed my ear to the door. The paint was cold under my cheek. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. Not even the faintest noise. I leaned my weight gently into the door, not hard enough to push it open, just enough to reassure myself it wasn't about to swing inward. The wood felt solid. I reached up and turned the lock carefully until I heard the click. That click sounded far too thin compared to how much I needed it to protect me. For the next few minutes I just stood there listening. The refrigerator cycled on in the kitchen. A car passed somewhere down the road. I started convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe I bumped the counter and the vibrations traveled. Maybe the metal warped from temperature change. I tried to settle back into the normal rhythm of the night. About 5 minutes later, just as I was trying to finish the dishes, another sound reached me. It wasn't the handle this time. It came from deeper, somewhere beneath the door, down the stairs. It was a dragging scrape, slow and heavy, like something rough being pulled over concrete. Then another scrape, slightly shorter, then a pause. My whole body went cold. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't pipes, it had weight behind it. It sounded intentional, like something shifting itself down there. I didn't move toward the door this time. I backed away instead, keeping my eyes on it as I reached for my phone on the counter. My hand was shaking so much I nearly dropped it. I called the police, trying to keep my voice steady. While I waited, I kept the lights on and stayed in the far corner of the living room, where I could see both the front door and the hallway. I didn't hear anything else from the basement, but that somehow made it worse. The silence felt held, like something was waiting. The police arrived about 8 minutes later, though it felt much longer. I heard their radios and boots on the porch before they even knocked. When they came inside, they went straight to the basement door. Seeing them pull their flashlights out made my stomach twist again. They had me stand back while they unlocked the door I had locked earlier. When they opened it, the air that came up was colder than I remembered it ever feeling down there. They headed down the stairs slowly, lights cutting across the concrete walls. I couldn't see much from where I stood, only the shadows moving, the flicker of their beams. After a moment, one of them called up faintly that I should stay put. They spread out as much as the narrow space allowed. I heard them moving things, footsteps across the floor, the low murmur of careful assessment. When they finally came up and motioned me forward, I followed them down the stairs. The basement looked different from how I left it months ago. The dust on the floor near the storm cellar doors was disturbed in wide, messy patterns, footprints tracked in from the outside, overlapping each other. Near the back wall, blankets and a sleeping bag had been laid out in a corner I never used. There were empty cans. An old jug half filled with water, a crumpled grocery bag. It looked lived in, not just used once. Someone had made a place for themselves down here. One of the officers was kneeling in the far corner, studying something half buried in the pile of blankets. He lifted it with a gloved hand. It was a sandwich, no longer whole, edges bitten off. At first I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I remembered the exact sandwich. I had thrown it out 2 days earlier, irritated with myself for letting it sit too long in the fridge. It made no sense that it was here. That meant he'd been upstairs, not just in the basement. Upstairs, in my kitchen, close enough to open my trash, close enough to eat something I discarded, close enough to move around my home when I wasn't there, and he had been coming up more than once. The track marks in the dust showed a repeated path from the storm doors to the stairs. The basement door had faint smudges near the handle, like someone had pressed fingertips there many times. While the officers checked the storm doors outside, I walked around the basement slowly. Nothing felt familiar anymore. Even the things I had stored, old boxes, a spare chair, a toolbox, looked wrong, as if their presence had been rearranged or touched. The sleeping bag was worn, the kind someone would carry for long stretches. The cans had labels from different brands, some pulled from my own pantry trash. Everything pointed to someone who had been staying here not just for a day or two, but long enough to feel comfortable. I kept thinking about all the times I left the house without locking the storm doors because I didn't see the point. I thought about mornings when I assumed I misplaced food or forgot to take out trash. Nights when I heard a faint sound but convinced myself it was the house settling. I thought about sleeping directly above this space, completely unaware that another person was only a thin layer of floor away. Later, after they cleared the place and made sure no one was hiding outside, the police advised me to stay somewhere else for the night. I gathered only a few things because I didn't want to be inside any longer than necessary. On my way out, I paused at the basement door again. The house felt different now, as if it had been peeled open. I kept imagining the quiet of the nights before, how normal everything had seemed, and how someone else had been living in that silence too, moving around with careful, measured steps. The next day, I had new locks installed on every entrance, including the storm doors. I fixed the flickering kitchen light, because I couldn't stand the dim edges anymore. I cleared out the basement completely, sweeping every corner, removing anything that could create a hiding place. Even after that, the air down there felt wrong. Not because of anything supernatural, but because of what had happened. It was the knowledge that someone had been close enough to hear me walk, breathe, sleep, and live my life without me ever knowing. For weeks afterward, every small sound in the house made me pause. Every creak in the floorboards made me listen harder. But the night of the handle jiggling stayed with me the most. That was the moment when his quiet hiding slipped, when the life he had built beneath me pushed against mine. It was the smallest sound, but it exposed everything that had been happening without my awareness. Nothing else ever happened in the house after that. No more noises, no signs of anyone returning. But I never took the silence for granted again. I learned that someone had lived in my home without my permission, watched my routines, and moved between my absence and presence like a shadow that belonged to the structure itself. And even though he was gone, and even though the house was secured, the knowledge of how long he had been there, the half-eaten sandwich proving it, became something I could never fully forget. I had always liked the idea of shared living, because it kept the house from feeling empty. Even when I spent evenings alone, there was comfort in knowing someone else would eventually come through the door, drop their bag, and move around the place. That weekend was different. My 2 roommates had driven out to Portland for a music festival, and the house had a strange hollow feeling the moment they pulled out of the driveway. I brushed it off, told myself I'd enjoy the quiet, and spent most of Saturday stretched out on my bed with the window cracked open for a bit of cold air. By the time I finally settled in under the blankets that night, it was well past 1 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I kept checking the clock on my phone while scrolling through the same social media feeds I always checked when I couldn't fall asleep. It was 1:32 a.m. when the sound downstairs snapped me out of my haze. I had the brightness turned low, and for a second I wasn't even sure I heard anything at all. But then the faint click of the front door latch carried up through the hallway. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even hurried. It was the gentle, unmistakable sound of the door opening with a key. The house was old enough that every door and step had its own distinct sound. I had lived there long enough to learn all of them. I knew exactly what the deadbolt sounded like when it turned. I knew the hollow creak of the front door hinges. This sound didn't have the hesitation of someone forcing their way in or jostling a lock. It was smooth, intentional, familiar but wrong. My first thought was that maybe one of my roommates had changed their mind about staying the whole weekend and didn't bother to text. I waited for the usual things that followed their late entries, the shuffle of shoes coming off, the rustle of jackets. Instead, I heard slow, heavy footsteps on the hardwood. The sound grew clearer as whoever it was moved farther down the hallway that led toward my room. The footsteps didn't stop in the common areas. They kept coming, each one measured and steady, until they reached the exact spot outside my bedroom door. I lay there completely still. The only light in the room came from my phone screen. I turned it over so it faced the mattress. The footsteps stopped right outside, and the silence that followed was thick enough to feel. The air had a sharp, cold edge to it, the kind that sinks deep into your chest. I waited for a knock or for the door handle to move. Nothing happened. I tried to call out softly, just enough to break the tension without sounding scared, but the words barely left my mouth. There was no response at all, no shift of weight, no indication that the person had heard me. Then, after several long seconds, the footsteps moved away at the same calm, steady pace. They didn't go back toward the front door. They headed to the opposite end of the hallway, the one that led toward the narrow door we hardly used. That door opened to the small attic ladder built into the ceiling. The sound of the ladder unfolding had a deep metallic clunk that echoed through the upper floor. I heard it now, each section sliding out with a heavy scrape. Then the creaking steps of someone climbing up into the attic, slow and deliberate, until the faint thud of weight on wood overhead settled into place. I lay frozen in my bed, unable to make sense of any of it. The attic was usually padlocked from the inside of the hallway door, but the lock didn't matter much because the ladder itself was the only entrance. I had only been up there a couple times to put away old boxes. It was cramped and dusty, filled with insulation and old belongings from previous tenants. I reached for my phone again, my hands shaking as I scrolled through my contacts. I called one of my roommates. she answered groggily, and hearing her voice made it instantly clear that she was nowhere near the house. When I asked about the keys, she told me only the three of us had them. The landlord kept a spare, but he lived all the way in Spokane and never came around unannounced. Hearing that tightened something deep in my stomach. It made the quiet upstairs feel heavier, as if whatever waited up there was pressing down on the ceiling. I didn't move from my bed until the police arrived. The minutes before they showed up felt like hours. I could hear the faintest creaks above me, unsure if they were footsteps or just the house settling. Every so often I imagined someone crouched directly above my room, listening to the same silence I was. When the officers finally walked through the door, their presence felt unreal, like they were stepping into a nightmare I hadn't fully woken from. They moved upstairs with flashlights, each slow footstep echoing through the hallway. I stayed downstairs with one of the officers while the others pulled down the attic ladder again. The sound of the rungs unfolding made my chest tighten all over again. They spent a long time searching the attic, long enough that my nerves started to fray all over again. Eventually they told me there was no one up there. No sign of anyone leaving recently. The insulation was thick and loose, scattered across most of the attic floor. But in one corner there was a cleared-out area, the insulation pressed aside to create a sort of nest. It was large enough for someone to sleep in. Right next to it, sitting neatly in a sealed cardboard box, was a quilt I recognized instantly. It was an old childhood quilt stored in a plastic tub in the downstairs closet. I hadn't seen it in years. Someone had gone through our storage. Someone had carried that quilt up into the attic. Someone had been living up there long enough to carve out their own space in the insulation. The officers believed whoever it was must have heard me as soon as I stirred in bed, or maybe even heard the first sound of my roommate answering the phone. They might have slipped out before the police arrived or down through the back fence, while I was too focused on listening for movement inside the house. The attic had no other exit, but the rest of the house had enough hiding spots that someone familiar with the layout could have waited for the right moment. When the police finally left, they suggested staying somewhere else for the night. I didn't need convincing. I grabbed a bag, locked the door behind me, and drove to a friend's place across town. Even hours later, sitting on her couch with the living room lamp on, the image of that cleared attic corner stuck with me. It wasn't just the idea of someone sleeping above me. It was everything that implied. The way they moved through the house without hesitation. The way they stayed silent outside my door, as if studying something. The way they carried a piece of my past up into their hiding spot. Something gentle and personal I hadn't touched since childhood. What stayed with me the most was the realization that the front door hadn't been forced. Someone had used a key. Not a copy made recently, according to the landlord. A key that had belonged to a previous tenant, one they must have kept when moving out and somehow held onto until the day they needed it again. Someone who knew the house, knew its layout, knew the attic was the best place to hide. The worst part wasn't the night it happened. It wasn't even the police walking up and down the stairs with their flashlights. The worst part came later, when I finally understood that the footsteps I heard that night were not the beginning of anything. They were the end. Whoever had been living above us had probably been coming and going long before I ever heard the door. They had probably walked the hallway countless times while we slept, learned the familiar sounds of the house, and moved through it as comfortably as we did. When I moved out months later, I still avoided the attic door. I refused to touch the ladder again. Not because I believed someone was still up there, but because I knew someone had once been, and I had never heard them until the night they wanted me to. I woke at 12:49 in the morning to a sound I knew too well. My garage door had a deep, grinding rumble that made the walls in the hallway tremble whenever it opened. It was the sort of noise that crept into your sleep, even when you felt certain you had locked everything. That vibration rolled through the floorboards beneath my bed and pushed my eyes open. For a few seconds I stayed still, disoriented, wondering if I had dreamed it, but the fading echo convinced me it was real. The first thing I did was go to the bedroom window, pulling the curtain back only an inch, so the glow from the streetlight wouldn't give me away. The garage sat on the side of the house facing the street. with a small patch of dead grass in front of it where I had been meaning to plant something. The door was moving upward, slow and uneven, the same way it always did when I pressed the button on the remote, except I hadn't touched anything. I had left the remote on my nightstand. The door kept climbing, metal grating, until it was halfway up. That was when a leg slid under it, a man's leg, bent low, slipping beneath before the door had fully opened. He moved with a sense of practice, as though he had done this before. For a moment I didn't react. My brain tried to force a harmless explanation into place. A malfunction. A neighbor's remote with the same frequency. A repairman at the wrong house. Anything but a stranger intentionally coming inside. But he didn't wait for the door to finish rising, and that detail snapped everything into focus. I felt my heartbeat shift into something sharp and fast, the kind that makes your skin heat up and your hands go numb. I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone, careful not to turn on the screen. The brightness felt like a risk. I slipped into the closet at the far end of the bedroom, one with a sliding wooden door that always stuck slightly at the bottom. I pressed myself behind a row of hanging clothes and let the door fall almost shut, leaving a sliver of space in case I needed to see out. The house felt too quiet. All I could hear was the blood in my ears, thick and pulsing. I stayed there, waiting for some sign that I had imagined the whole thing. Instead, the sound of a footstep came from the kitchen. It was soft but deliberate, the kind of confident weight you hear from someone who knows where the tile ends and the hardwood begins. He moved slowly, not in a frantic way but in a steady, familiar rhythm. The door from the garage opened into the laundry area, and from there to the kitchen entrance. I could track him by the shift of sounds as he moved from one surface to another. He didn't wander like someone lost. He followed the hallway. My house had a narrow corridor that led past my office, the guest room, the laundry room, and finally toward my bedroom. I knew he was passing each doorway by the pause in his steps. It was the quiet held between footfalls that made it so unbearable. He would stop, stand still for a moment, and then move again. The footstep would echo gently off the hardwood, then vanish, then repeat. I could picture him turning his head, scanning each space, making small adjustments in his path. When he reached the door of my office, he stopped long enough that I felt my lungs tighten. He paused again at the guest room, then at the laundry room. He was checking the rooms in order, following the exact layout of the house like he had walked it before. The thought crawled under my skin. Most people who break and make mistakes, they move quickly, bump into furniture, open drawers, shuffle through things without pattern. But this man was moving with intention and familiarity. His footsteps came to a stop outside the bedroom. My closet door was thin, old, and not insulated. I could hear the faint shift of fabric when he turned his head. I could feel the subtle vibration of his weight press into the floorboards through the wall behind me. He wasn't trying to force the door. He didn't test the knob. He just stood there. The air inside the closet felt thick and stale. I pressed the back of my skull against the drywall and kept my mouth closed so tightly my jaw hurt. I tried to stay completely still, but my hands were trembling so hard I had to wedge them between my knees. The seconds dragged into something much longer. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing loudly enough for me to hear, which somehow made it worse. I didn't know if he was listening for me or simply thinking. The closet was small, and with every passing moment I felt the rising need to inhale more deeply. But I forced myself to take quiet, short breaths through my nose. My throat burned from holding them in. At some point the dizziness began. The air felt too hot. My fingers prickled from lack of circulation. I had no way of knowing how long he stayed there, but it felt like an hour. Time in situations like that becomes stretched, warped by fear. Every second felt like a minute. The pressure of silence made it impossible to guess what he was planning. I kept imagining the thin wooden door sliding open, a shadow filling the gap, the weight of his footsteps coming toward me. Then finally, so soft I almost doubted it, I heard him step away. One foot, then another. Not rushed. Just leaving the same measured pace. He went back down the hallway. I tracked him by the creak of floorboards through the kitchen, and then to the laundry area again. I imagined him lowering himself under the door the same way he came in. The faint rumble of the garage door came next, shaking the walls again, retreating back to its closed position. And then nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no engine sound, Just silence. I stayed in the closet long after the noise stopped. I didn't trust my body enough to move. My legs were weak from staying crouched, and my hands were numb. When I finally slid the door open, the bedroom felt strangely cold, as if the air had shifted while I was hiding. I checked the hallway from the doorway without stepping out, scanning each room with the phone's flashlight. Everything was in place. No drawers open, nothing stolen. It was as though he wasn't there for things. He was there for the house itself. When I finally called the police, my voice shook so badly the words blurred together. They arrived quickly, lights off, moving through each room with more confidence than I ever had in that house. They asked about the garage door, the layout, the timeline. I answered everything in a fog, still picturing the moment he stood outside the closet. They checked the garage door remote and found nothing wrong with it. They checked the interior door from the garage and noted that it showed no sign of forced entry. The only useful information came from the neighbor. He had a camera pointed toward the street, because his car had been broken into the month before. The footage wasn't great quality, and the streetlight glare made it grainy, but it showed a car parked across the road from my house. It arrived a little after 9 in the evening. I hadn't looked outside then. I was doing dishes, then showering, then watching a show before bed. The car stayed there for hours without moving. According to the officer, the man didn't get out immediately. He sat in the driver's seat with the lights off, waiting. Eventually he opened the door, stepped out, and crossed the street. He didn't hesitate or look around. He went straight toward my garage like he knew exactly how to approach it. They watched him disappear under the door and then come back out after some time, returning to the car without running or hiding. The car left a few minutes later. They told me that people like that often study a place for days or weeks. They learn schedules, habits, and light patterns. They learn which nights the house stays dark longer. They wait for small mistakes. Sometimes they enter through the easiest point, sometimes through the most unusual one. The officer tried to reassure me that whoever it was might never come back, since he already got inside and likely realized someone was home. But reassurance didn't settle anything. The next day I replaced the entire garage door system. I added stronger locks to every door and put alarms on all the windows. I packed a bag and stayed with a relative for several nights because every sound in the house made me tense. Even weeks later, the memory of those footsteps in the hallway still rose up at random moments, sharp and unwelcome. It wasn't the thought of someone breaking in that bothered me the most. It was the way he moved around the house with such calm, and the way he stood at my closet without touching the door, as if listening for something quiet and specific. Knowing he waited outside for hours under the cover of the dark made it worse. He wasn't impulsive. He was patient. He watched the lights go off one by one, waited for silence, and then entered a place I had always believed was mine alone. When I finally walked through the house again in daylight, the floorboards felt different under my feet. The rooms felt altered, as if a small part of the space had been claimed by someone else, someone who understood its layout more deeply than I wished anyone ever would. Even now, when I sit in bed at night, I catch myself listening for the faint vibration of the garage door. It's quieter now with the new system, but my body remembers the old rumble. Whenever I hear a noise outside, I think of the way he moved past each room, how he knew their positions, and how he paused in front of the closet without pressing his hand to the door. That moment, more than anything, remains etched in my mind. It was the quiet certainty that he wasn't surprised by anything he saw or heard. He walked as though he had already memorized every part of the house, and that knowledge has settled into my life in a way that has never fully left.